Hello, and welcome to the Mothers of All Crime. This is a podcast where we deep dive into mothers involved in infamous crimes and scandals. I'm Monica, and this is Crystal. So, our mother this week is Diane Downs, a notorious, alleged female murderer. I don't know how familiar you are with Ms. Diane, but this is like one of my big true crime, like probably one of the things that I was first interested in true crime. A case that like I think about kind of often, I feel like. So I'm excited to talk about her, but I do feel like she is kind of obscure. And I don't know if it's the time period or I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
yeah.
That's interesting that this is your kind of intro into our obsession because she is an older case and she
Mm-hmm.
isn't someone that like we've talked about ones that we've lived through and that we may have seen on the news or very like popular. She is very obscure and I didn't really know too much about her until we have had conversations even before we started doing these recordings. And she definitely is one of the OGs. She's definitely one of the earlier kind of female criminal sides that became popular. Because I think there is
Yeah.
a lot of media attention per se, but not uncommon for a female to commit crime. But it really was
Sure.
the time period
It's
when society started accepting it and realizing that women, particularly mothers, are capable of some really horrific stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, as women gained more rights, we also gained more consequences, which is, in my opinion, a good thing. But I think that there were a lot of murders, attempted murders, especially child abuse type things that maybe weren't picked up by the media, weren't viewed the way that they are now. And I think that Diane Downs changed how a lot of people view moms and women in general. She was infamous for sure. And I think that maybe it wasn't in our lifetime. It's an older case than we are. So I think maybe that, you know, that could be why this wasn't
Yeah.
like a big deal to you. I think that I just stumbled into some of her interviews and documentaries about her when I was a kid. And then she's always just sort of stuck in my head. And I've watched everything about her that's ever come out, I feel like.
Fantastic.
Um,
Well, why don't you start telling us who Diane is?
sure.
Because,
So she was born Elizabeth Diane Downs, but she started going by Diane as a child, and that's really stuck. I don't think anybody calls her Elizabeth. Um, Seems like she had a pretty normal childhood. It kind of depends on what time period Diana speaking about her childhood, the way she describes it. There were definitely points where she talked about being abused, neglected, sexually molested by her parents, but I'm not sure if any of that is true because the stories have been very inconsistent. Um, she had three younger siblings who she felt got more attention than she did. And she grew up in a religious family and um, ended up going to a very religious, very conservative college which did not last very long because in the 80s, you could be kicked out of college, especially a Baptist college, for being promiscuous. So she got kicked out like in the first semester
which
of
is wild
college.
to think about. Can you imagine if that was like a constant rule in today's modern age? Like, almost everyone I know would
No.
have been kicked out of school.
Oh my God, definitely. I mean, I just think it's like what college is for, sort of, like you're supposed to be
Yeah,
a
if you're
little
gonna,
promiscuous. I mean, I don't know how bad it was. It's
it would
hard for
be
me to believe.
interesting to know like what their standard of promiscuity was because I think from society, but then also like the religious college side would probably have two different standards. Just like there are some universities
Right.
even now, like uh Brigham Young is a big one
Brigham Young.
where there's still a lot of
Mm,
active moral clauses. And I know there's a couple other Christian
that's
universities
true.
that do the same thing, but none of the schools I went to did. They were all kind of
Yeah, no,
don't get
definitely not.
arrested was the rule.
I don't even know if there was a dress code at my college, but I went to a liberal school. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. But I mean, I don't know if it was her dressing or if she'd been caught engaging in sex or there was just rumors about her. Like, I'm just not sure how that would be confirmed at the college level to the point that you'd get expelled, but she
Right.
certainly was expelled. Um, and she came home and moved back in with her parents in Arizona after getting kicked out of college and got back together with a boyfriend that she had in high school, Steve Downs, because she was born Elizabeth Fredrickson. And she got back together with Steve Downs. They got married, and so she became Diane Downs. She very, very quickly, so they got married in 1973, and then they had their first kid in 1974, Christy, and then they had another child in 1976, Cheryl. Um, so at that point, this is also something that there's multiple accounts of, but my understanding is after the birth of their second child, who was a very difficult baby in comparison to their first kid, they were having financial problems, marital problems, childcare problems, and Steve decided to get a vasectomy. And um, after that, had a she had a pregnancy and had an abortion. And then she felt a lot of conflicted feelings about that abortion. She had named the fetus and she wanted to replace the fetus. So she was trying to convince her husband to reverse his vasectomy. He would not. So she went on the hunt for sperm and seduced one of her friends and ended up having a child who she named after her husband, who was definitely not the father. So that's Stephen Daniel.
Which is
And
such an
yeah,
interesting
name
tactic.
choice.
Yeah, like
The name is weird.
the fact that her husband also was
Like,
kind of like, sure, name him after me, consciously knowing that he was not the father of this child is
yeah,
just wild to me. But I think it's interesting for conceptualizing it is that she openly announced, and I don't, at her trial, I don't know if she ever said it prior to, but she married Stephen to get away from her family and her parents, and she didn't marry him because she loved him. I think it was just
right.
a man of opportunity who loved her, so she took advantage of the situation. And it would be interesting if he, at some degree, was aware that she was kind of using him, and that's why he didn't have as much of a problem, where like he kind of just was expecting it to happen. I can't try, I'm trying so
I
hard to rationalize his mindset here.
Steve is a weird character to me. I think that he loved Diane, but I think that they also just had such a tumultuous, toxic, breaking up, getting back together relationship. And I think there were many infidelities on both sides. And I think when you have a dynamic like that, and you also have two children that you're raising together that are definitely both of your biological children, and you're married, I think that maybe thought it was easier to stay together and embrace the baby as opposed to breaking up the family.
Well, also in that time period, divorce was still looked down upon, particularly if you were raised in a traditional kind of household or any kind of religious household where your extramarital affairs and your financial issues and your disagreements was you just got over it. You either dealt with it or ignored it because divorce wasn't an option. And I think they were married and adults during that gray period where that's what they were taught, but the world was changing. So it kind of wasn't it was an early error for divorce.
Yes. I could see that. I think that it was a conflict of like religious upbringing, and he was in the military, and they had these obligations with their children, and I think that he was also having affairs, and so it's also sort of hard to be like Diane is the only problem. And I think that as we go on, we're going to talk about how she's very manipulative and very charming, and I think that um, it's not a stretch to me if she was able to just kind of keep things moving along with him when she needed him, financially
Yeah.
at least,
Hmm.
and childcare wise. I think that she was able to manipulate him many times, and I think, you know, for them, cheating was part of the dynamic.
Yeah. So obviously their relationship continued, and he went into the Navy. She was also employed. I saw her having, she kind of bopped around a lot. I think the most notable
Hmm.
one that I saw was she worked for the Postal Service, which I think is kind of funny because it's not the easiest job to get. They do look into you pretty intensely, but at the same time, you don't necessarily need to be the most competent person at the same, like, and no disrespect to anyone in those positions, but it's one of those, they do look into you. And once we gotta go through everything, it's kind of ironic that you had an employer that looked that deep into her history for what she ended up doing.
True. Although I guess at the time, her rap sheet was clean.
True.
They weren't gonna see that she was too fun at college. You know what I mean? They weren't going to know about that. But yeah, she worked at the post office. She also was working as an electrician at a motorhome company, and she was apparently very good at it. I think that Diane, um, I think she's very intelligent, and I think that she um, can be very charming when she wants to be, and that combination tends to lend itself pretty well to a workplace, at least temporarily.
Hmm.
So I think that, yeah, I mean, she was probably fine at the post office.
Yeah.
I think that it's just at home where she had some struggles more so
Yeah.
than at work.
She definitely was described as being intense with her
Mhm.
children and very strict. And her, Steve kind of later on talked about how she just lacked an overall material maternal instinct for her children. And
Yes.
I think that was probably the first red flag for me going through her story, because there was one story that I noticed with her daughter where her father caught her doing something she wasn't supposed to do, put her in a timeout, and her daughter's first reaction was if there was a gun in the house and that she wanted to kill herself because mommy said she was bad, which for a little kid is a really dramatic response to getting in trouble. Not the I'm so sorry, I shouldn't do that. Just it's really sad that that's her kid's mindset at a very early age.
Yeah. It seems like she was not very good with children at all. She didn't understand how to relate to them. She didn't have a big maternal instinct, which is ironic because she's extremely fertile, or at least she was extremely
Right.
fertile. And she would, I mean, there were multiple interviews where she would talk about, I just knew my cycle so well. And if I wanted to get pregnant, it would be so simple. And I would just decide, like, I'm just going to get pregnant. And I think she loved being pregnant. She just didn't really like the kids.
What came
Um,
afterwards?
right. Which is why I mean, she did do something really wonderful at one point in her life, which she was a surrogate mother. Um, she carried a baby for another couple after she had Danny, after, because her and Steve ultimately did get divorced in 1980. And after that, Diane had seen a program on TV about surrogacy, about people who could not have children, and she made $10,000 doing it, which is a significant amount of money, especially in the 80s, would be a significant amount of money. But it's also a big emotional and physical toll and a beautiful thing to do for someone. And I think that it really, maybe is what she should have only done is be a surrogate mother, because I think she probably excelled at that. She loved
Right.
being pregnant. It was easy for her to get pregnant, stay pregnant, have healthy full term deliveries. So, I
And
mean,
also, if you have that ability that to detach, which she has shown with her
that's a
already
good point.
having her children,
Hmm.
I feel like a lot of people with surrogacy, it again, this is just my guess, would be there's a lot of emotional attachment to being pregnant and delivering a baby, particularly if it's not ultimately to be your baby. And her ability to detach from that would have made her an amazing surrogate, where given, she could have made a ton of money and helped all of these families very easily if she wanted to.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that she should have probably just stuck to that. It would have probably been better. I think she was an amazing surrogate. Probably she did try a couple of other times where it wasn't successful. So it was just the one time that she was a
So much
surrogate.
for
But
her super fertility.
well, she was getting a little older, I guess, so maybe it was catching up to her. She had her first baby. She was only like 18, so everyone's fertile when they're 18. But
Fair.
um,
Fair.
so so she's divorced from Steve, and of course she has many, many lovers, because that's a big thing for Diane. But there's one guy who she is, I think the word would be obsessed. She's
I would
obsessed with
agree.
him. Yeah, so that's Robert Knickerbocker, um, who she calls Nick, and she ended up getting a tattoo of Nick's name on her arm.
Because that always
He
goes well.
I mean, 100% of the time. Like, that's a
Hmm.
guarantee that this
Yeah,
relationship's going to work out.
it's true love.
Yeah. It is. That's it. Um, and she did not care that he had a wife, obviously, because did, did that wife have a tattoo of his name? I don't think so.
I know. What a
So,
slacker.
exactly. So she clearly didn't care about him as much as Diane did, and she was very obsessed with him. And she wanted him to leave his wife, which he wasn't going to do. And this is so he's living in Arizona. She's writing him letters, she's calling him, she's saying a lot of things, making a lot of promises about them being together, and he basically is trying to let her down easily and saying that you're great, but I just don't want to be a dad. I don't want to play dad to your kids. Like, it's just not going to work out because, like, you have children and I don't want children. She tells him the kids will be no problem. He disagrees. She moves to Oregon and expects him to follow her, which he did not do. Um, so she's just kind of left in Oregon with these three kids that Nick does not want.
Yeah. And I think I would love to have like a full rundown by him where he was like completely transparent about their early stages of their relationship, because every affair, particularly for married people, I feel like starts off with them saying, "Oh, I love you. I'll leave my wife for you, blah, blah, blah," to get it going. And then they either realize that they messed up and like retract, or they keep on with the charade. And I think for Robert, it would be curious if he ever kind of said things like that to her, or in Diane fashion, she just decided that she wanted him and then continuously pursued it aggressively, assuming that eventually he'll just break down and cave and be with her.
So I definitely think that he was a very willing participant initially. I think that, they worked together, they had this kind of saucy workplace romance happening. He probably complained about his wife. He probably complained about all kinds of things. Told her how special she was. They probably had all of this crazy sex. And I'm sure everything was extremely fun and romantic. But then she wanted him to leave his wife, which he wasn't going to do. She wanted him to move in, play dad to her kids, which he was not going to do. So I think at that point it kind of started to sour for him, and I think he was relieved when she moved and had absolutely no intentions of following her.
Yeah. But she didn't leave him alone either.
No, no. She was stalking him.
Yep,
She was
kept
threatening to kill
going.
his wife. Yeah. I mean, yeah, she was very into him for sure and was not planning to. Although she has said in later years that she was not madly in love with him, that she just loved him, but she'd never been madly in love with anybody.
Which, looking at a lot of the things that she says after the fact, it is very manipulative, very convenient, very. I don't want to put the word narcissistic on her quite yet, might later,
Sure.
but it seems that whenever something doesn't go her way, like Nick not following her to Oregon, not giving it, not leaving his wife, well, I don't truly love him that much then. Is like protecting any kind of feeling that she did have, because God forbid it did happen, I bet her answer would have changed. I absolutely loved him. Love of my life.
Right. Exactly. I think it's like it's a retelling. It's saving her ego, distancing language. Like he wasn't that big of a deal to me. Like I could have had anyone, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Which it makes sense with what ended up happening that her story would change like that. But I definitely think um, it seems to me, by any definition, that she was madly in love with him. I think very unhealthily, bizarrely attached is how I would probably phrase it. So I think that none of this is Nick's fault, I don't think. I think that he's a bad husband, a bad person, not defending him, but I don't think the things that happened in this
I,
case are his fault.
I think he just had sex with the wrong person.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is terrible to say, because I agree. Bad husband, bad dude, but just bad judge of character is really where he went wrong.
Terrible, terrible judgment calls were being made by him. Absolutely. But I don't think he's like an evil criminal who masterminded any. Like, I think that he just was another idiot that slept with her.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, didn't care about. Which there were multiple, extramarital affairs that she was participating in. It was not just him, but he was just her favorite at the time. Um, but yeah, she's doing the single mom thing,
Yep.
and she's
It kind of
it's
brings us
kind of
up to
right.
1983.
Right. So May 19th, 1983. Diane, I'm just going to set the scene of what's happening and
Yes.
just tell everything from Diane's perspective, I think is how I'm going to start it. So Diane, like many young single mothers with 3 little children does, she's driving at night in the middle of nowhere down a road she'd never been down before, blasting Hungry Like a Wolf by Duran Duran in her car. She's sightseeing, even though it's past 9 o'clock at night, so it's pitch black out. Normal, normal. So she's driving, and there's this shaggy haired man in the road, and he is attempting to flag the car over. So obviously, she pulls over, and this shaggy haired stranger shoots the 3 children, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny, in the car, shoots Diane in the arm. Diane, in an act of heroism, thinking on her feet, pretends to throw her car keys into the bushes, and the shaggy haired stranger, like a golden retriever, runs after them and runs away from her. So she jumps back in the car and she races to the hospital, pulls up to the hospital screaming, "My children have been shot. I've been shot." She has a bandage on her arm, but who knows how that got there. The children are all just openly bleeding. So she gets them to the hospital. They're all immediately treated. Diane has a very minor injury compared to the kids. And she immediately is being questioned by police. The kids are being assessed, and the kids are in critical condition. One of them, Cheryl, passed away. She was DOA. It's very sad. She's only 7 years old. Christy, the 8-year old, the oldest child, she was 8 at the time of the shooting, and she ended up losing so much blood that she hemorrhaged and had a stroke, which has left her with permanent disabilities. And then Danny, who's only 3 years old, was shot in his spine and ended up with paralysis from the waist down. So it's pretty horrific injuries that happen. And of course, Cheryl has passed away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And during all of this, Diane just has a grazed bullet surface level on her arm, and her
left
3
arm
children are completely
maimed.
Yeah. Their lives will never be the same, the ones that did survive. And
absolutely,
with this kind of story and scene that she was telling cops, they started kind of looking at her a little as a person of interest, because a lot of things just weren't adding up from their perspective. And rightfully so, because as a single female, let's take the kids out of the car right now. You're driving down a deserted road. I, in a million years, would never pull over to the side of the road, get out of my car to talk to a strange man on the side of the street.
Yes.
I don't know any female in their right mind who would. And then adding your kids in the car.
Yes. So Diane, because like I've said, she has given many, 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 many interviews to the media. She has said that she would pick up hitchhikers all the time. That she had no concept that men would do anything like this to her, that nobody had ever, shot her or her kids before. So she had no concept that he was going to do that. He didn't warn her that he was going to shoot the kids or shoot her. And so she just could have had no idea that he was a threat to them. That's her explanation for it.
Which I will say, in this time period, hitchhiking was a lot more common.
Definitely.
But I would argue at this time it was starting to be not as often. Because listening to like my grandparents' stories, hitchhiking was not a big deal at that point. But my mom's time frame was she was like, there's no way. She's like, I wasn't gonna go like getting in some stranger's car. She's like, it's weird. And I think our generation is like, absolutely not. You're not getting in my car. Like, unless I know you specifically.
Right.
So I guess depending on how she was raised, I could see that. But also,
but you wouldn't have to get out.
Right. Why are you throwing your car keys out into the woods if you're in your car? Like, you should never have got out of the car to begin with.
Yes. And I mean, Diane would later go on to do a full police reenactment that was filmed of this crime. And she's giggling through the whole thing. She's cracking jokes. She's, she has her little sling on because it's pretty soon after the accident that she's doing this reenactment with the police. And, she like bangs her arm at some point and says something that she stopped herself in the middle of talking, but the cops thought that she was going to say, "Oh man, that hurt just as bad as when I shot myself in the arm," basically. Which she did not say, but she does say a lot of weird, inappropriate things that she thinks are funny. She does a lot of smiling, a lot of giggling, a lot of, eye rolls, stuff like that in the video. which is just
Yeah.
strange. I think her behavior is always going to be the stuff that is the most damning for Diane. Um, because sometimes there's evidence, which there is some physical evidence, which we can talk about, but also just her behavior in the hospital, in the interviews, in the police interviews. It it's nothing short of bizarre. She's extremely calm. She's extremely flippant. The first call she makes at the hospital is to Robert Knickerbocker, to talk about their great love affair. Um,
Not the children's father.
right.
Hmm.
Not that. Not their grandparents, not, not not anybody, not the friend she was supposed to be, supposedly had been visiting with prior to this incident, who you would think would be someone you would call before your married lover, would be, oh my gosh, we just left your house and you'll never believe what happened.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, anybody, pretty much anybody would make more sense to call. But,
Yeah.
yeah.
So during their investigation, they did start collecting evidence and forensics, where that's all kind of, I think, what coupled with her behavior, police really started to not believe her story. Um, their blood spatter, there was nothing on the driver's side, where if she was shot in the arm, there should have been some kind of blood on that part of the car.
Right.
She did not disclose to police that she owned a weapon, which I have mixed feelings about, because
I
typically
know.
that's not something you just disclose to police. It's not one of the
Mhm.
first questions I've heard they typically ask in these situations, unless there's a reason to. Um, they also could have just ran her name and it probably would have come up. But she did own a 22 caliber handgun
Mhm.
that she had had for years, and the gunpowder residue also didn't make any sense when it came to her car.
Right. It just didn't line up with her version of events. And the blood spatter from the kids on the car, on the clothes, the distances that she was supposed to be could not have been possible, essentially. She had to be extremely close to the children when these shots were fired for the blood spatter to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. And she did know how to shoot that gun because it was her gun, and she had gone to shooting ranges, and she had taken, she knew how to load it, she knew how to clean it, she knew how to do everything.
Which, for living in Oregon, like that's not super uncommon, or Arizona, like they're areas
Sure.
that it doesn't shock me that she may have also grown up with them, which again would just give her more comfortability around weapons. Um, but then you start having comments by Nick, for example, who was not, he's like, I absolutely think she would have killed my wife. Like, she had this
Hmm.
history of violence, and you had people who already were like, well, it wouldn't shock me if that happened, which can't be good for your investigation if you're trying to get away with something.
Right. I think one of the more damning witnesses in this case, because it does ultimately go to trial, is someone who was driving behind Diane after the shooting.
Mm.
There was a witness that was stuck behind her car for like 10 minutes because she was only going about 5 miles per hour. The witness actually said that his car stopped registering his speed. Like his speedometer was not working because they were going so slow, and they were unable to pass her car because there was no pass lane. So the car, as opposed to Diane's version of events where she, raced to the hospital and sped there to get her children into the hospital as soon as possible, these witnesses who had, plenty of time to observe the car. They said that it was a red car that had Arizona plates. Like the time of night, it was a very desolate area. So it really could not have been anyone else, and she was certainly going well, well, well under the speed limit, which is bizarre behavior.
Right. And to play devil's advocate, if you recently just watched your children get shot, you yourself were shot, that is going to be excruciating pain, both emotionally and physically.
Mm-hmm.
So, focusing would probably be really difficult, maybe. I don't know. That would make you drive a little bit slower.
Sure.
However, why wouldn't you just call an ambulance at that point if you're having that much trouble rather than slowly but surely making your way?
I mean, I guess she wouldn't have had a phone,
But
right?
there, like, she definitely would have drove by some kind of house or gas station or
Or even, she could have flagged down the car that was behind her.
right, like something. It's not like you just driving, and bam, here's the hospital. Like there's things around
That's
it.
true.
So if you're in that much of a having so much trouble, you should have done something. And it didn't, nothing that I could see did this witness say that she was driving erratically, she was swerving, it seemed like there was an issue. It was just that she was going 5 miles an hour and wouldn't speed up.
Right. Exactly. So things start to unravel for Diane. Um, and after her series of media interviews, she's ultimately arrested for murder, an attempted murder, and assault. And while this is happening, Christy has started to really recover physically and mentally, and she's regained the ability to speak. So, something that I
Mm-hmm.
thought was really interesting, I don't know if you came across this, but Christy was seeing a therapist. Obviously, she was extremely traumatized. She was an 8-year old little child who had been shot, who had a stroke, who was having this incredibly difficult recovery. She was seeing a therapist, and the therapist would ask her, what happened, who shot you, who shot your brother, sister, mom, whatever. And Christy was unable to talk about it, unwilling to talk about it. So they started doing this method where Christy would write down the answer, seal it in an envelope, and burn it. So this went on for many sessions where the therapist would ask, write down who did this to you, who the perpetrator was. And if you're not ready to tell me, that's okay, and we'll just burn it. So she started doing this, and then eventually Christy felt comfortable enough with the therapist and felt strong enough in herself to show what she had written, and what she had written was my mom.
Which is just so heartbreaking
It's really
because
sad.
this is the same little girl that had been in the same house where her sister was concerned about getting in trouble and saying that she should kill herself because she got in trouble.
Right.
And I can't imagine if that's what her experience was, that she didn't have a similar one as well. And so you're dealing with the fear of what happened, you're dealing with physically recovering, um, and then just the understanding that your mom did this to you because at that age you're still have faith in the world where the idea of your mother doing that, I think probably no matter how bad her mom was hard to admit. And if there was any kind of abuse, the fear of retaliation was probably there as well.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of grief. There was a lot of physical like this child had the world stacked up against her, and I think that it was nothing short of heroic. that she was able to describe what happened and ultimately be a state's witness, um, a key witness. And
Yeah.
I think that it's very impressive and she's very brave. And um, I don't know how many kids could have coped in that situation. And I hope that I mean, I know that she had a lot of support, and I just, I don't know if it could ever be enough.
Yeah. I will say too, though, for someone of that age to have been a witness, like there are steps that you have to take from a court perspective. They're not
Mm-hmm.
just going to put an 8-year old on the stand and hope for the best.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there are processes. So she had to be a very smart and confident little girl in order to do that, even taking away the fact it was against her own mother. One thing that I couldn't figure out, and I don't know if you have found the answer, was if she was living with who she was living with during this recovery. Because I think if she was living with mom, that makes a huge difference on maybe she would have
So
said it sooner. Because
she
Diane
was
wasn't
not.
arrested for till 9 months after the shooting.
So I can explain. So she was like initially in the hospital, and could not leave, but there was a case that was opened against Diane, and my understanding is that Christy and Danny were in foster care. Um, the courts hadn't figured out entirely what had happened, and I know that Diane and Steve were both trying to get visitation, and Diane was not allowed to have visitation, but Steve was, and he'd started with supervised visitation and had begun to get unsupervised visitation prior to the start of the trial, I believe. And he ended up losing that and losing custody of the kids entirely, where they reverted back to just being in foster care because he was sneaking the kids to see Diane. He was allowing them to see her
Hmm.
because she was under investigation already, and she did not have custody of the kids during that time. And then Steve also did not end up with custody of the kids either, or any
That is
visitation.
true. Right. That is true.
Yeah, yeah. That's why Steve doesn't have them now. I mean, I know they're adults now, but because I always thought it was very strange that Steve wouldn't have just automatically gotten custody of them, because that is what would typically happen in this kind of situation if the mother went to prison. Um, but that's not what happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Diane obviously was arrested, which I think we noted,
Hmm.
and charged with one count of murder for her son and, oh, excuse me, her daughter, and
Yeah,
two
Cheryl.
counts of attempted murder and criminal assault against her
Hmm.
daughters,
Right.
which is a heavy charge.
Absolutely. And she completely denied it. They had a full trial. She was psychologically assessed. There were many diagnoses that were thrown around. I think one of the big ones is narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. There have been reports of her being a sociopath, a psychopath, delusional, borderline personality disorder, um, malignant hysteria, psychopath. I think that there are many ways to describe her, but she basically has no remorse. She has no empathy. She has no remorse. She has no ability to put herself in other people's shoes. I think her kids are just extensions of her, in her opinion. And she was very offended by the charges against her. And I mean, to this day, adamantly denies any part in any of this. But I think she was a bad witness. I think the jury really did not like her. And she was sentenced to the strongest sentence they could possibly give her, which I'm a little confused about. Like, is it just that? I should have looked this up, but is it that Oregon doesn't have the death penalty? Is that why she couldn't get it? Or is the
Most
crime
states
not extreme enough?
don't have the death penalty
Hmm.
anymore.
I
Let's
wonder
see
if
if
in
we
the
can find
80s.
that
I
out.
should look this up right now. Because
Well,
she
it's
was.
interesting
I'm
because
sorry.
I was gonna say she did get guilty on all counts.
Hmm.
And yeah, so the death penalty was part of Oregon's history, but it only has executed 2 people since 1963.
Okay. There's probably all
So
types of rules. Sometimes you have to commit multiple murders also.
yeah, so looking at current rules, it pretty much their heaviest sentence in reality is life in prison without parole. But she was actually sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years with the ability to be paroled,
Right.
which, when it comes to a parole board, you need to accept responsibility for your part in the crime. You need to show how you have improved, how you're going to contribute to society, and testify in front of a board of people. And then they make the determination if you are eligible for release or not. And Diane has come up multiple times for parole, and every single time she has been denied and been considered a dangerous offender that she should never be allowed back out. And not once has she ever said that she is responsible. Her response every time is, I told you and I told everyone else that a man shot my kids, and I have never wavered on that story.
Yeah. I mean, she
So,
loves to say that she doesn't change her story, but she
yeah,
does change her story all the time because she's
right. The
changed it multiple
details.
times. The details.
Yes, she
Yeah.
changes details,
Oh, and something
which,
important I forgot to mention when we were talking about her trial is that she was extremely pregnant for her trial and her sentencing because
yes.
after losing Cheryl to murder and her other children to foster care, she was very lonely and sad. So she, because she's so fertile, decided to just go out and get pregnant. And so she got pregnant, and by the time of her sentencing, she was past her due date. And I mean, not her sentencing, her conviction. She was 9 months pregnant. She went to jail, and 10 days before she was sentenced, she gave birth in prison. And the child was immediately taken away from her and given up for adoption,
Rightfully
which,
so.
of course, was going to happen. Yeah, I mean, what else was going to happen? Um, I don't think she's ever said who the father was. I'm not sure if she even knows.
I
Um,
wasn't able to find that either.
yeah, I looked and I wasn't able to find it. And I know that that child grew up and has made statements about trying to find her biological father. I don't I don't know if she ever has. We can talk about that in a minute, but I realized I didn't mention that, and it was very important because again, Diane, is extremely fertile, and she, I think, thought that she would be more of a sympathetic defendant if she was extremely pregnant. And it's like, who's going to send a pregnant woman to prison for the rest of her life? But I mean, it didn't work on the jury or the
Right.
judge.
I
But
completely agree with you because I think she definitely played on the woe me, my poor mom, like viewpoint
mhm,
with the jury that just didn't catch. And one thing that, particularly with the parole board, that I think is important is the district attorney actually writes to the parole board whenever she goes up and reiterates that she has never demonstrated any kind of honesty regarding the circumstance of that has happened.
right.
And he writes in a way assuming that she is guilty, which I kind of agree with, but she still adamantly says she's not.
Sure.
And he supports these allegations with small details that she has said throughout different interviews and testimonies and things like that contradict themselves. And I think
Yes.
one that I thought was interesting was for her assailants changed.
Hmm.
So she
Yes.
had that bushy haired stranger from the beginning. And then in a different version, there were two assailants and they had ski masks on. And then someone else was a corrupted police officer who had pulled them over. And then another one was a drug dealer that just came out of nowhere. So it was always consistently someone else's fault, but whose fault it was changed.
Yes, that is true. Because I did watch an interview with her where she said that the shooter knew her and called her by name, and
Mm-hmm.
that she knew who it was. Because there's also that also is important because there were many points where she's claimed that she knew exactly who it was, or that there were leads pointing to the identity of the shooter, and implying that the police and the prosecutors weren't doing enough, and that she needed to take matters into her own hands, which is one of her justifications for why she broke out of prison, because in
Yes.
1987 she scaled an 18-foot razor fence. She put a coat on the top of it. Like, she climbed up the fence, put her coat on the top, jumped off, hid in a parking lot, ran multiple blocks, and showed up at the front door of one of the other prisoners' husbands. And she stayed in his apartment with him for 10 days until she was apprehended, which caused an absolute uproar for her surviving victims and their families, because by that time, all of her children had been legally adopted. And they were all, them and their parents were terrified that Diane was out of prison, because she's extremely dangerous and terrifying. So I think one of the more heartwarming parts of this story is that the prosecutors in the case, well, one of the prosecutors and his wife, Fred Hughey, ended up adopting the two surviving children from the
Mm-hmm.
shooting, Christy and
Yeah.
Danny, which is really beautiful, honestly. I read one report that said that Fred went to see the kids in the hospital after the shooting, and it was the first time he'd ever met them. And he laid eyes on them, and he said that he just knew instantly that they were his kids. And I
Yeah.
think that's beautiful.
It really is. And it kind of, there will always be cases that just touch you differently, I think, in that line of work. And this was just, I guess, one of them, and that they adopted children with very severe disabilities too. That they
Mm-hmm.
were not going, there was going to be some serious challenges that they were going to face mentally, physically, and as a family. And what a powerful couple to take that on out of a pure place of love and desire to help these kids. I think it's
Yeah,
amazing.
I
But
think it's really wonderful. And they didn't have other kids prior to the
right.
adoption. Yeah, so they became parents to children with horrible trauma, physical, mental. I mean, it was a very difficult situation, and they really stepped up, and they became parents to them, and so they were raising the kids. And when they found out that Diane had escaped from prison, I mean, they were terrified.
And
Um,
rightfully so, because not only from the case itself, but there is so much more evidence and information and data that goes into a case that either doesn't go to trial, doesn't get brought up, doesn't make it to the media. So this couple knew every single detail that happened. And then being so acutely aware of what she's capable of to her children, I think just amplifies it. It's not like there were a third party that adopted these kids and found out it was a horrible crime. They know every single detail.
yeah, that's true. That's
Mm-hmm.
also true of the baby that was adopted, who became Rebecca. I mean, Diane named her. Amy Elizabeth after herself, which is also insane. But
On track,
the
though.
baby the baby was adopted by a real family who renamed her, of course, and they were not planning to tell her about her mother. They thought it was going to be too traumatic and upsetting for her to hear that, your biological mother is in prison for shooting your biological siblings. I mean, I think that that would be, I don't know how you would explain that to a child, but they had to start telling people in that child's life about Diane when she escaped from prison because they were terrified that she was going to show up at the preschool, that she was going to find her when she was with her babysitters, like all kinds of. I mean,
Right.
I can't imagine a situation worse than that, for the adoptive parents, because I mean they knew exactly who Diane was, and they knew that they were adopting the baby born to such a horrible person. But I think that they had some comfort that she was going to be serving life in prison. So,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to give her a whole different life over 100 miles away. She's not going to have to know her. The other kids have been adopted into a loving family, and they knew all of the details. So they didn't think they would ever have to really deal with Diane. And then she's out. So then they had to start telling people. They still didn't tell Rebecca, but she found out, a couple years after Diane had escaped from prison and gone back to prison. She kind of tricked a babysitter into, like, oh, I already kind of know, and like the babysitter ended up telling her, which
Mm.
I think caused. I mean, Rebecca has been through a lot, and she really spiraled after finding out about Diane, and she went through a lot of really difficult times where she abused drugs and had depression, and she ended up, being quite promiscuous, if we can use that term, and having a child and giving it up for adoption. And she went through a lot of struggles. I think she's really turned her life around. I know she's also done a lot of media. I did watch her interview with Oprah, and I think mostly she just really regrets ever reaching out to Diane at all. And I think maybe things would have been different if Diane had not broken out of prison. But I mean, she'll stop at nothing to traumatize all of her kids.
Yeah. I will say her escaping prison is a little impressive. It is not something that you
Oh,
hear
yeah.
very often, let alone successfully doing it and being out for 10 days. It takes a lot of planning, a lot of execution. There's not a doubt in my mind that she had help that never was publicized internally, because the chance of
Mm-hmm.
you scaling an 18-foot razor wire fence without any assistance is slim to none. So I think she probably put on that charm that she's so well known for and got some help from some guards that were never publicized, in my opinion. But she did
I agree.
get transferred to another state because of that and because of the fear of the families, where she ended up getting moved to New Jersey and very, very far away
Yeah.
from any of these kids. Because if, God forbid, she did ever escape again, she couldn't get to them.
Right. Which Fred, the prosecutor, really went to bat for. After she'd been captured, he just said that it was too dangerous for the children for her to remain in the state. So they sent her as far away as possible to the prison that is now called Edna Mahan in New Jersey, which is like the maximum security women's prison here.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I mean, she
yeah, I
also
mean, she
bopped
didn't
around in
stay there that
prisons.
long though.
Yeah, she bopped
Yeah, because
around.
she ended
She
up
went,
right. She's in California now, I think, right?
yep, she went to two different ones in California. She still is in California, as far as I'm aware, uh, and just
Mm-hmm.
living out her sentence, where continuing her denial. Every time she goes up for board, she says the same thing, and they deny it because it,
Yeah.
which is shocking to me that she doesn't challenge it anymore or doesn't change her tactic, because she is a very smart person to a degree, and she knows how to read a room. And anyone who goes to prison who abuses children tend to have a harder time in prison. So I can't imagine her stay is very comfortable. It's surprising me that she hasn't manipulated her way out. Why wouldn't you just say it to get out? I don't know. That's the one thing that does shock me with her, that she maintains this innocence.
So I watched her Oprah interview that she did in 1987. I watched that this week. And then I also, her parole hearing from 2020 is on YouTube. The full thing is on YouTube, just the audio. And I listened to most of it. And it is absolutely maddening. It is so frustrating to listen to her talk. She talks in complete circles. Nothing she says makes any sense. She's trying to make herself seem very good, but she's just lying. So she would be very manipulative if you could not fact check her. And I think that she thinks she's much smarter than the parole board, but she's underestimating them. And I mean, she filed for an appeal of the parole decision that she got in 2020, which was a big no because she's always been denied for parole.
Right.
And I mean, she was blaming COVID for why she doesn't do more group therapy and why she hasn't made improvements during her stay in prison. And that was during 2020. She was saying that it was because of COVID. You have been in prison for over 30 years at that point. That doesn't explain all of the time before this that you haven't been making improvements. She did get an associate's degree in prison, but she's done
Mm-hmm.
very little therapy, work on herself. She is not an asset to the prison community in any way. She has had a lot of conflict. She's had a lot of issues. She has been in, what do they call it? SEG, where you're put away. She's been in isolation many times, fights with inmates, sexual behavior, a lot of different things. She's very unpopular in prison. And I think that she's she's very smart and she's very manipulative. But if you have all of the information, it's much harder to be manipulated by her. And I think that the parole board knows that she's full of shit and it's going to look at all the notes from previous years. Also, at this point, I
Oh,
don't think she can change her
absolutely.
story, but she should have changed it 35 years ago. I agree. I mean, she'd probably already be out if she had just taken accountability, but she cannot admit to anyone that she has done this. And some people really believe her. There is a big, not a big, but there is a faction of people on the internet and in real life that supported her, that thought that she was just maligned for being a slut, essentially. That she was just looked at as a bad mother and a promiscuous woman, and that's why she was convicted, because a lot of the evidence is circumstantial, essentially. Um, I don't agree with that, but I know, like, her parents, for example, who she accused of abusing her and then took that back, supported her until their deaths. Her father
Right.
passed away in 2017, and he was one of her biggest advocates up until that point, maintaining her innocence, fighting for her to be able to get out on appeal, helping her financially. It's hard for me to believe, but I think some people are taken in by her. And I think if you had a lot less information, it would be easy because when she talks, it sounds like she knows what she's saying. She speaks with a lot of conviction and a lot of arrogance,
Well, she
and
has that
it would be
aura to
convincing.
her. That
Yeah.
presentation of a very kind woman. Like if you just see a picture of her, your brain doesn't go to crazy or your brain doesn't go to murderer. She looks very put together. She presents very well. And I think she has the ability to show different people different versions of herself to get them to have sympathy for her in that circumstance. So it's that same thing of her parents probably saw a certain side of her and she argued it for that exact reason.
Absolutely. Speaking of what she looks like, does she remind you of anyone? Just like her face?
Her face reminds me of a couple of people, and I can't honestly. She looks like that. What is it? Some actress that I'm drawing a blank on, like Brady Bunch vibes. Like, but I have a feeling
Yeah,
you're
so
alluding to another person we talked about.
no, not yet. Someone we will talk about. To me and to a lot of people on the internet, she looks like Janelle Evans from Teen Mom. I feel like they have the same face. Yeah. Well, Janelle's had a lot of work done also. I think if Diane had not been in prison, she probably would have also gotten her chin corrected. There's things that Diane that I think Janelle actually looks pretty good now, but I think like in the early days, the eyebrows, the eyes, the chin, like everything to me just screams Janelle. And I think that's really all I have to say about Diane Downs. Unless you have more to add, I think we could probably just wrap up here and we'll catch everybody next week on the Mothers of All Crime. Have a good night.